What does this sound like? What does this feel like to you?
Well, the first thing we would say is what took them so long, because we know how Putin really deals with traitors. We've seen this in terms of what happened in the UK with Skripal and Litvinenko. So none of us should be surprised by this. What would be interesting is to see the entire passenger list, because one of the things that they were saying about why the mutiny, I don't think it was a coup, because there were certain objectives which Prigozhin had. First one was to prosecute the war better. The second was to get rid of Gerasimov and Shoigu, and the third one was to produce or make sure his business empire continued. So one of the reasons it failed was because the Russian intelligence services, those who were always the kingmakers and who might replace Putin, the FSB, the SVR, and the GRU, threatened the Wagner families. So I'd be as interested in who were the other 9 people on the plane. Are they acolytes of Prigozhin? Are they in the Wagner or former Wagner chain of command? Because really, Wagner has no legal status anymore, and that's why there was quite a large discussion about whether it was going to be registered as a legal entity in Belarus, and whether therefore the sort of notion of hybrid grey zone warfare rather than being provocative on the NATO borders came into play. So none of us are probably really surprised. I think this plays in with what we've seen with Surovikin today, who did want to do the same things as Prigozhin in terms of prosecuting the war better. I do think there'll be a continued surprise. What the mutiny showed really was an element of the prisoner's dilemma. That's a psychological, philosophical model where you either stay loyal or defect. Prigozhin didn't stay loyal. Lots of others didn't defect. Those who did attempt to defect towards Prigozhin's view, they will be dealt with, and I think there'll be a serious purge.
A serious purge. Does this leave Putin stronger then? I mean, if there is a continued purge, then one would say probably yes to that. But what's your analysis?
Well, I didn't think that after he was marching on Moscow that Putin would be out of power in a month. I still don't think that he will be there. I think people tend to disregard the fact that Hitler was in power for 12 years and Putin's been in power for 24 years. He's been able to hack the minds of the Russian people, and as long as there are enough people staying loyal to him, and as I said, the Siloviki, the men of power, which includes all those intelligence agencies, as long as they're still online with Putin, and even if he were to go tomorrow in terms of a natural death, that's Putin. Some of the successors are even worse than him, and that includes some of the heads of these security services.
What do you make, Major-General Chip Chapman, of this move in the context of the wider invasion of Ukraine as well, the ongoing war there? And particularly in my mind right now is the mood, the morale, the attitude of Russian armed forces. How does a move like this at home play on the front lines?
Well, there's 2 aspects to that. The first aspect is the loyalty aspect. So really, if you go back to when Prigozhin was losing it with Putin on the 25th of May, he sort of said to prosecute this war properly, we need waves of mobilization, massive production of ammunition, and we need to live like North Korea for a few years if we're going to achieve our maximalist objectives of sort of removing Ukraine from the map. And that is, if you have the Putin line that you really want to increase your territory and increase your spheres of influence, and I do think that's one of his grand strategic objectives, you would need to do those things. That's the same sort of thing that Surovikin wanted to do. Now, that's a different thing than if you're fighting on the front line. And the variables which are often not known in war are, will people fight and how well will they fight? Now, one of the interesting linkages with this guy is that he had all the contracts for rations for the Russian troops on the front line. So with the removal of the Wagner group after the mutiny, whether the supply of the rations is still sort of swept up, and it wasn't really anyway, to ensure that everyone gets their 3,000 calories a day. Because if you've got a limited ration supply, your medical supply is bad, and your logistics are being constrained by how the Ukrainians are fighting their deep battle. You never know when the morale string will be overextended and break, and that's when you get armies marching off the battlefield, as happened to the Russian army in 1917 and in Brest with the peace treaty at Brest-Litovsk. And that was exactly what Putin warned of. He warned of a revolution that could come in the way that the Russians could lose this war. He wanted more of a mobilization because otherwise they're not going to achieve any of their objectives.
In terms of what happens next, Major General Chip Chapman, what would you anticipate? And I'm thinking particularly of President Putin's own actions from here on out.
Well, you've got to remember about how Putin deals with these people. So Putin will not mention this at all. If you look at how he deals with people that he perceives to be either traitors or those who he has a very negative attitude about, he will never mention their names. He never mentions the name of Navalny. He never mentions the name of Zelensky. He will not mention Prigozhin at all, in my opinion. If there is a comment, it will be by his press secretary, Peskov. I mean, I don't think Putin will say anything about this guy at all.